Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'd like to thank the International Cannabis Solutions, LLC, and Kevin Hall, Joy Davies, my husband, and the entire Cannabis team for inviting me here today to speak before this esteemed group of professionals. I'm happy to be in Canada. I'm so proud of you for accomplishing something that has electrified the whole world, legalization of cannabis. Basically, Canada is the first major economy to legalize recreational cannabis, beginning a national movement that will alter Canada's social, cultural, and economic fabric and present Canada with its biggest public policy challenges in decades. So, I'd like to start first by giving you guys a round of applause, actually. I'm confident that you will be able to succeed and lead the rest of the world. As a judge in the United States, I have a lot of authority, but I have no magic powers. I cannot change the past. I cannot make people fall in love.
Yeah, you can.
And I can't turn unhappy people into happy people. What I can and must do is help defendants develop plans to overcome their problems and prevent havoc from spreading in the community. Well, I can tell you, working in a busy courtroom provides plenty of chances to make lemons into lemonade. Tammy's story is one that reminds me to watch out for opportunities, especially when things turn bleak. As I recall, Tammy came into my courtroom, she wiped her eyes, she wiped the tears away as her probation officer read her most recent violations to a packed courtroom. 3 drug screens positive for cocaine and opioids, several missed drug tests, failure to attend mental health and substance abuse treatment, skipped probation appointments, and no payment towards her fees. Tammy looked and sounded defeated. When I asked about the allegations, Tammy told me that her brother had recently died and he was murdered. She held up a copy of his obituary and cried softly as she described her family being torn apart by grief, opioids, and anger. Tammy said she was the glue holding her parents together, her siblings together, and her children together. And she feared for her children's safety. She intended to go to probation appointments and she intended to go to treatments, but her obligations got lost in her family obligations. She knows what we all experience, that being a grown-up is very difficult. It really is. It's hard. Unfortunately, adult problems can spin out of control if ignored, and parenting is particularly challenging, especially when family members can't support you or provide encouragement. Even under the best circumstances, violence and mental health can shatter support systems and overwhelm coping skills. Helping a defendant break these self-defeating habits and dangerous circumstances, it's very critical to improving the safety of our communities and the quality of life for families. According to the National Institute of Health, approximately 1 in 10 adults suffer from opioid abuse. Among addicted adults, as many as 60% may have serious mental health issues. If not addressed, other legal, health, familial, financial issues will follow mental illness and addiction as predictably as compound interest. However, for families in crises or individuals who feel beaten down, it can be impossible to imagine a better life without assistance. So despite her terrible circumstances, Tammy came to court as ordered. She was afraid of going to jail, but she was desperate to find a way out of her addiction. So we talked about the link between violence and opioid addiction and our city's record murder rate, Chicago. Tammy did not know that mixing opioids can interfere with mental health medications, particularly antidepressants. And she didn't realize that she could talk to her counselors about the grief that she was experiencing from the murder of her brother. She didn't realize she could talk about the anxiety and the depression. And these were things that she needed to know in order to move forward. So we talked about these things. Her willingness to change her life for the sake of her family gave me a glimpse into her character. I knew she was a good person. By focusing on short-term objectives and engaging in appropriate treatment, Tammy returned a month later with a more positive outlook, clean drug screens, and a new cannabis prescription to help her battle her depression. Her road to recovery will be long and rocky, but she now realizes she doesn't have to walk it alone. As judges, we watch out for things that don't sound right or seem unusual to spot danger. We also seek positive signs that defendants and families may have more going on for them than they actually realize. So there were other circumstances that I experienced that were not as favorable. From time to time, I've regretted some of my judicial rulings. Many of my judicial rulings, they still haunt me today. And many of my colleagues will never admit that. They will never admit that they regret a ruling. Well, any judge who says that he or she has not felt judicial regret is not being completely honest with themselves. Judges bear the burden of trying to balance the rights of the accused against the responsibility to protect the general public and potential victims. So this can result in haunting consequences. I will tell you my experience with this. When I was on the bench, I had occasion to sentence a young man to rehab, and I ordered him released from jail. He was to report the very next morning to a rehab center, but instead he murdered another young man that evening. Now, while I realized that the murder was no fault of my own, I do regret releasing the young man. Another scenario still haunts me today. When I first got on the bench, I released 3 criminal defendants from jail on their own recognizance. I told them they were free to leave, to return, but all 3 of them overdosed and died within 3 days. So, I have another story about a man. His name was Jason. He lived in a small town in Illinois. Sometimes we would ride the circuit. So I was downstate, and this small American town had about 64,000 people. And that particular town witnessed 10,000 deaths as a result of opioid abuse since 2010. By the time Jason was 17, he was addicted. His 2 older brothers, his mother, his father, his grandmother were all opioid addicts. By the time Jason was 24 years old, he had been in rehab twice and relapsed twice. After his second relapse, he descended into a downward spiral which resulted in his death. His remains were left at the county morgue unclaimed because it cost $300 to collect his ashes, and no one in his family could spare the risk of being unable to feed their addiction by paying $300. So many families are torn apart by the opioid crisis in America. It was then that I did some research. The growing epidemic of opioids has been declared a national emergency in the United States and Canada. The opioid epidemic is the most significant public health and public safety crisis facing our 2 countries. In the court system, the opioid crisis challenges us because 208,000 children are removed from their homes in 2015 due to opioid drug misuse by the parent or caregiver, and accounted for 1/3 of all removals by the court. Opioid cases are draining the budgets allocated to the court systems. Statistics reveal that between 1999 and 2015, the death rate for opioid overdoses was highest among 15 to 19-year-old youth. Because recognizing that juvenile and family courts are often the initial contact point for an opioid abuser and a critical partner in providing opioid abusers with substance abuse treatment and support, it's vitally important for the juvenile and family courts judges to be a part of the conversation on how to best address the opioid epidemic. So many families are torn apart. My final story is about a young lady by the name of Lyric McHenry from New York City. I practice law in New York City. I read about Lyric. I happen to have heard a little about her prior because she was a Stanford University graduate and she had a budding film career. Last month, Lyric turned 26 years old and she had a birthday party that she slipped away from at a Manhattan hotel. She slipped away without saying goodbye to her guests. A few hours later, her lifeless body was discovered on a desolate street in the Bronx. She had scraped knees and a glassine envelope in her pocket. It contained cocaine. The perpetrator dumped her body on the sidewalk in the early morning hours, and she was found later at 5 a.m. on the gritty streets of New York City. Miss McHenry was a young woman who many people felt was going somewhere. She was on a reality TV show. Friends and admirers watched her from afar, waiting to see what would become of her. Maybe a screenwriter or a movie producer, maybe her own reality show, or a politician. She was very bright. She was at a moment of bright possibility, with all the avenues of a successful life branching out before her. The spotlight on Lyric McHenry in life had meant that she was on the verge of becoming someone. But the spotlight on her in her death seemed to foreclose all of those possibilities. In the headlines and stories that followed, she was reduced to the facts as written in a police report. Young woman, pregnant, possible cocaine, alcohol, and heroin overdose. Deserted streets in the Bronx. What more could there be? What can be done? Many states are moving to substitute opioids with medical cannabis to quell the opioid epidemic. Last summer, New York and Illinois took a relatively new approach by modifying existing medical marijuana laws to allow certain patients to substitute their opioids with medical cannabis. New York and Illinois patients with an opioid prescription or a condition which an opioid is indicated can instead buy cannabis at a registered dispensary with a physician's written certification. After he okayed the new regulations, the New York State Department of Health Commissioner Howard Zucker, MD, JD, said in a statement that the action offered providers another treatment option, which in critical step in combating the deadly opioid epidemic affecting people across the state. In Illinois, Governor Bruce Rauner said the law he signed into effect in August is creating an alternative to opioid addiction. Why allow substitutions? Some experts say these laws can be in response to several studies that indicated opioid overdose deaths were lower in states that permit medical marijuana, and that opioid prescribing was lower for Medicaid and Medicare Part D programs in states with legalized medical cannabis. Other U.S. states are looking into substitution laws as well. It's of growing interest to policymakers in the United States that are hoping to potentially reduce the epidemic, but the science is just now starting to look at this specific issue. It makes sense, but is it an effective substitute for an opioid? Given the opioid epidemic's toll, it makes sense to try substitutions, in my opinion. We know that cannabis relieves pain. Enacting substitution laws are one way where people see that they can address their pain. But most people agree that it's a reasonable thing to try. If you're going to certify someone for medical marijuana, you should use it to wean the opioids down. Case reports have shown that medical marijuana helps some patients with pain to reduce their opioid use by 60% to 100%. In a survey examining medical marijuana safety in older adults, about 2/3 of 2,736 patients past age 65 used medical marijuana for cancer or non-specific pain. Among 791 patients who answered questions about their medication changes, 18% stopped using opioids or reduced their dose after 6 months. We need more research from the United States and from Canada. Small studies and poor quality evidence often leads experts to the same conclusion. More research is needed. This is a really big issue. As states are moving forward with their cannabis policies, the federal government is not keeping up. And in fact, the federal government in the United States is hampering scientific discoveries. That's no surprise, of course. Medical cannabis is legal in 31 states, the District of Columbia, Guam, and Puerto Rico, even though federal law deems any cannabis use illegal. The DEA classifies marijuana as a Schedule I drug with high potential for abuse and severe psychological and physical dependence. The only U.S. source of cannabis the researchers can legally tap is from a federally overseen farm at the University of Mississippi. But cannabis from the farm is a very different product than is used by everyone else. Some reports indicate that commercially sold cannabis could have levels of THC that are 2 or 3 times higher than that comes from the federally run farm at the University of Mississippi. So investigators who want to study cannabis face extensive regulatory and supply barriers imposed by federal cannabis prohibition in the United States. I personally advocate for more research. Some recent animal studies have indicated that cannabidiol has potential for treating opioid use disorders. Similar studies should be allowed to go forward in humans, and well-designed clinical studies with institutional review board approval and patient protections. We need to be able to do the research to help figure out what the best policy should be and what critical care should really look like. But the area to really focus on is getting effective treatment to people who need it. People like Tammy and Jason and Lyric. When I hear a person tell a story like Tammy's or Jason or Lyric's, I know that it is my job to look for a path out of an awful situation. Not a path to perfection, but to a better place for all of us. I'd like to thank you for having me here today. Don't know if we have any questions, but I'd be happy to entertain them. Yes, ma'am.
Here in Canada, one of my friends works with vets and cannabis and helping with their clients. Do you think that there will ever come a day in the United States where, you know, the vets obviously, that particular part of the vets do a lot of these programs? Do you think they would ever implement a research program for vets?
That would be awesome, wouldn't it? I know that before I left the state of Illinois, post-traumatic stress disorder was one of the qualifying conditions for medical cannabis in Illinois. I live in a legal state now, and so the research is probably not taking place so much in Nevada, but probably some of the states that have just medical cannabis I think we would definitely benefit from the research. I know many people who advocate for vets in the United States. I have heard that there has been some movement in that area in terms of allowing cannabis for post-traumatic stress disorder, which, as you know, affects so many of our veterans. Thank you. Yes, sir.
You said that what we need is more research.
Mm.
And I would respectfully submit that the U.S. National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, I think it was last year, surveyed 10,000 of the 20,000 studies that are out there on PubMed and concluded that notwithstanding the difficulties of doing the research, the evidence is conclusive that it's effective for chronic pain. That's the source of the opiate crisis. And so there's no excuse for the governments of the day to not be moving expeditiously forward based on the existing evidence to deal with the opiate crisis. Those are my submissions.
I agree. Well, thank you. We'll have to share notes. All right. Well, yes, sir.
Yeah. May I call you Shelli?
Oh, of course.
Shelli, I was very moved just by your humanity and what you've seen, what you've experienced. And I kind of just want to ask us all to pause, and I'd like you to maybe just comment on, here we are, this beautiful plant that has so many healing properties, calming people's nerves, just so many things that if we would have had it legal and not repressed it, would we have needed all these opioids? And how do you feel, having been part of a whole system that prosecuted people for this plant? Yet, as long as you had FDA approval for Oxycontin, you were fine, and bribe the doctors to prescribe it. So I love your humanity, and I'd like you to maybe go a little deeper into how you feel about the whole system.
Okay. Well, I ran for judge in 1996. I ran for the very first time with a young politician who was running for the very first time. I don't know if you've heard of him, but his name is Barack Hussein Obama. And he challenged me at the time as well. He said, Shelli, I just don't know why you want to be a judge. The laws are so onerous in the United States. I just don't know why you want to do that, why that would be your path. And of course, I retorted, well, I don't know why you want to be a state senator, young man. Little did I know that he would be the United States president. But when you take an oath, when you're sworn in to be a judge, you raise your right hand and you swear to uphold the laws as written. I had so many people come to me to ask, is there anything you can do to overlook the law? Is there anything you can do to change the law? And because we have 3 branches of government and the legislators are the ones who write the laws in the United States, there was very little that I could do. But of course I had discretion, and I also like to sleep well at night, so I was certainly much more compassionate, and I was, definitely a person who believed in the little guy. So I did what I could when I could, and I continue to advocate for those who don't have a voice. I got off the bench in 2013 to advocate in the cannabis industry. I'd seen so many movements go by while I served 18 years on the bench. I saw so many things happen that I wanted to speak on and wanted to become involved in, but because I had the robe and because I had an oath that I took. There were certain things that I could not say or could not do. But I stand before you now, having formed 2 organizations in the United States. One is the National Cannabis Bar Association, which is the attorneys who assist in the regulatory matters and represent the license holders in the United States. And I also co-founded the Minority Cannabis Business Association to assist those who are most affected by the war on drugs and to educate those persons who are seeking to gain entry into the cannabis industry. So we do what we can. We do what we can when we can. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, when do you expect the proper financial framework for each state on the federal level? Because initially when you legalize per state, you allowed to do business, but the first business people couldn't even deposit their profits into the bank. So now apparently you can at least deposit your money, but you cannot use your money on retained account towards your own business without any proper tax framework. How it's going to be resolved? It's billions of dollars.
Of course. Oh, absolutely. In the National Cannabis Bar Association, we work every day to find banking for our clients. There are credit unions now that are slowly coming around, and Credit Union 1, I was told, is one that's coming around in the United States. There's a lot of cash in cannabis, and it makes it very dangerous for the business owners to carry so much cash and not have someplace safe to deposit it. So I clearly understand your frustration.
It's not my frustration. I am Canadian. No, I am.
Well, you should have some empathy.
I do. But if Canadian company wants to have a business with US company and knowing those specific financial struggles that you guys have, and basically it's from the side as an observer, I look in it, it's a cash business. Well, drug dealers have a cash business too. So what's the point of legalizing if you're not allowing the proper financial framework?
Well, I own a cannabis business and I have a Chase bank account there, so I'm one of the fortunate ones. But by the same token, it's on an ad hoc basis. I wish you well. Maybe we can talk offline.
Deal.
Yes.
I have a question regarding sort of the laws. Because in Canada, we have a minimum requirement. So, for example, we can grow 4 plants in our residence. And then provincially, each jurisdiction can decide what they want, but they cannot go above that. So they can say 3 plants, 2 plants, whatever, but they can't go to 5. So can you help me understand the U.S. legislation, which says each state can have medical or recreational or both, but federally it's illegal? Like, that's the total opposite way of our thinking. So can you help me understand?
I think it has to do with our Constitution. Each state has its own authority, and so it's very confusing for us as well, I assure you. I actually left a state that had the most onerous medical program in the United States, the state of Illinois. To be allowed to have medical cannabis in the state of Illinois, a person has to submit themselves for fingerprinting. You can get opioids at the Walgreens or the CVS without fingerprinting, that's for sure. So the laws are just a mishmash, which is one of the reasons why the minute, the opportunity that I had to move to Nevada, to the West Coast, we moved because it was just too many things to process. So California is totally legal, Washington State, Oregon, Nevada, Canada. It is what it is.
Can I speak to that as a Canadian lawyer? U.S. criminal law is a state power. Each state has that. In Canada, criminal law is federal. And so that's the essential difference. So that when cannabis was made illegal, starting in Utah, it slowly worked its way across the country from 1910 until 1937, the U.S. feds made it illegal. Now we have individual states making it legal, so undoing what happened years ago, state by state. Canada, we made it illegal in 1923 by simply adding it to the Opiate Narcotic Act. The U.S. was 1937. Canada now, by the Cannabis Act, has made it legal across Canada, although provinces and local governments still have quite a role.
Well, even condominiums can be taken.
Strata councils. We're proposing the solution to that, but I'll leave that for another day.
Yes, ma'am. That's you.
I do. I've been in this industry now for a number of years, and what's made me crazy about watching what's going on in the States is that each governor now gets to act as a doctor and decide who gets to use cannabis and who doesn't. So God willing, if you're married and your husband gets Parkinson's and you get MS, that both of those are listed in the state that you're in. How is nobody challenging these governors who are acting like doctors?
You know, it's interesting because when Colorado became legal, there were so many people leaving their own individual states and moving to Colorado. and not just to get high, but to save their children, to save themselves.
Sure.
And I think that was the response that many of the states looked at, and they thought, well, we better get moving because we're going to lose half our population. So,
But it's so restricted.
it's so restrictive, which is, again, the reason I moved to Nevada. Because God only knows what's going to happen in the future. You don't know what illnesses your spouse will have. You don't know what illnesses you may have. And if you need access to legal cannabis, you just need it.
Right? Like nobody's challenging these governors to say you have no right to decide that you with MS can, but you with Parkinson's can't.
So Michigan just became totally legal, which is a great victory. And Illinois is going to be next. We have a new governor, J.B. Pritzker. He's campaigned. He said, the very first thing I'm going to do is legalize cannabis. And I received a phone call from his lieutenant governor. We spoke for about an hour before the election, and she's excited about getting some of our model bills, some of our legislation. She's excited about the opportunities that will develop in Illinois. So we'll have one more good state with legal cannabis.
Even in Colorado, they had to, years later, add PTSD, and it was a big celebration when finally people with PTSD, I thought, what? It's Colorado. How could that not have been on the list to begin with? But they had to fight for it.
You have to fight for everything.
It's just crazy.
You have to fight for everything. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
First of all, I just want to acknowledge what you said about those who are responsible for giving judicial service. I sat on the bench in Dominica as a magistrate, and in Dominica, the accused is allowed to choose what venue he wishes to be tried, and normally those cases are dealt with in the magistrate's court. It is the only offense for which the state allows the magistrate any latitude to fine any amount of money and subsequently for default of non-payment of the fine for any narcotics, any amount of the fine. Everything else is controlled by statute. And I agree with you when you say, you make some decisions and sometimes you regret it and you feel that there are several I made that I regretted, so I was quite pleased to hear that from you. And I mirror what I say my colleague, what he said about the humanity in which you came out. And I had been accused of being very tough as a judge, particularly with cocaine and the effects of it in Dominica, because cocaine is a lot cheaper, $3,000 US for a kilo of cocaine in Dominica. And that is pure cocaine. That's before it's split, that's before it's reduced. The neighboring islands on the French, back to the south and the north, you sell it, the Venezuelan bring it in at 3,000 US. It's at 10 to 15,000 US immediately by crossing into the water. The people who carry it into the water are paid by, they call it bricks. So you get 2 bricks to bring it to Martinique, sorry, 3 bricks to bring it to Martinique, 2 bricks to bring it to Guadeloupe. So you are paid by the same currency of the traffic, so you have no choice to be part of it. And we lost, during the time I sat on the bench, we lost over 200 young people between 16 to about 23. So we were very tough on the actual transshipment. But cannabis, we were very, very, very relaxed. In fact, in my case, most of the sentences we gave for cannabis was really community service. But the issue we have in the Caribbean, where you speak about the opiates and the cannabinoids, we don't have a pain management program in any of the hospitals throughout the Caribbean. And I remember going to the hospital while I was a judge. I sat, and a friend of mine took an operation. She was released at about 3 in the morning. She was still shaking in pain, having just passed through the surgeon's knife, but we did not have enough pain medication. Yet there is an abundance of volcanic produced cannabis on the island, with the strongest oil that I have ever seen. And I myself, I say I'm reformed because although I was a judge, sentencing people for narcotics, was tough on things like cocaine and other drugs. Because of the transshipment, I was very, very tough. But I'm reformed as a cannabis watcher because I've had to use the oil when I myself was poisoned deliberately, which I believe was a political attempt on my outspokenness. And the judges in the Caribbean are appointed, not like you have to present yourself for election in a public forum. In the Caribbean, they're elected and they're appointed by the country and rubber stamped by the judicial overseeing body, in our case, the Eastern Caribbean Judicial Legislative Commission. So in sentencing, if you find somebody guilty who have a political connection, then you're terminated, which is what happened to me. But it is the lawyers in Dominica and much of the Caribbean that have been pushing this legalization of cannabis. And we get scorn from the doctors, we get scorn from all sectors of society, but the lawyers are the ones that are pushing it. What advice do you have? Because it seems to me that the countries are being pushed slowly into the issue of legalization in the Caribbean. The economic union, we call it CARICOM, had discussions for years, but they have never reached any conclusion. And the countries are moving slowly. And you said like 4 trees. In Antigua it's 4 trees. In Jamaica it's 2 ounces. In St. Vincent, they're not exactly sure. And these things are just coming into legalization. So what do you suggest to those Caribbean islands? Because we're about 10 years behind.
Yeah, the first thing I would suggest is not to follow what the United States does. I would most certainly not follow into that footprint. Canada, it just makes so much sense. It really does. All right, one more question. Yes?
I was just wondering, obviously the opioid crisis is getting talked about in this conference and the relation to cannabis. Are certain states that are legalizing, Colorado, Nevada, a lot of those places, are they also actually starting to put different effects or restrictions on opioids? Is there anything, there's a lot of talk about legalizing cannabis, is there anything about actually restricting opioids as a prescription or access to it in the same way that they're allowing for cannabis? Are they also backpedaling on opioids in the same way? Or is there like a sort of direct correlation between those two?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the only 2 states that I know that has enacted an opioid alternative treatment law is New York State and Illinois. And I'm actually very impressed that New York State would do so, because I was under the impression that New York was a big pharma state, and that played a big part in why in New York their medical laws are very restrictive also. There's no flower allowed, there's only vape pens, and I'm not even sure, oils and pills maybe, I don't know. So to see that pushback against big pharma is amazing to see in New York. But honestly, it's big pharma. I think that's really the restricting factor.
You haven't noticed, or there isn't a big pushback or correlation between the states that are obviously embracing cannabis as medicinal or recreational use. They're not also then realizing not only should we make cannabis legal, but maybe we should limit the amount of opioid accessibility in the states. That's not happening so far?
No.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Then
That's
tell me
what
what
I
you
want to
know.
know. Is there a correlation between those two?
Well, remember this morning when I spoke in Florida, there are limitations to the amount of opiate prescriptions that we can write and how many pills we can write for. So we can only write for 3 days worth, and it has to be written for acute pain. I can get an extension and write acute pain exemption, which allows me to write up to 10 days. Anything beyond 10 days worth of opiate medication has to be referred to a pain management clinic or a pain management doctor. And those are the only ones that can write for beyond 10 days for the chronic 30-day pain relief.
And this is from the legislature?
That's law by Rick Scott.
Okay.
I guess I'm just wondering, is Florida the exception or the rule for that? Is that the general consensus?
Well, they're cutting back in many states as far as how much we as physicians can write for. However, the one that affects me is the one that I'm licensed in, which is.
The other thing that you're seeing is, and I think it's a bit of an oxymoron, but you are seeing a lot of clinical trials being conducted. They're called human abuse liability studies. And the intent is to try to make a more abuse-deterrent opioid. Having been involved in a lot of clinical trials of that sort, I'm skeptical of the success. And it's really just addressing the recreational abuse of opioids as opposed to overprescribing to your first level patient.
Well, let that be the final word. Thank you.